Imagine having a wife as your property. Imagine selling your wife because you just found out she cheated on you. Again, imagine selling your wife because you were unable to afford the costs of divorce. What if I told you that men actually had the opportunity to sell their wives? Would you be happy with that? Well, between the 17th and 19th centuries, wife selling was a weird custom with a practical purpose in the Victorian era. There were plenty of couples who knew their relationship wasn't just going anywhere and they wanted to part ways because they were just tired of each other or too much infidelity. But the inability to get a divorce put people in a really awkward and uncomfortable situation. Their only options were to be forced to stay unhappily married, bitter and miserable, abandon a wife to misery, or come up with an alternative solution. This is what prompted the custom of wife selling, which is exactly what it sounds like. Hi. Welcome back to History Rediscovered. Remember to support our channel, please subscribe. In this episode we discuss the disgusting wife selling practice that took place in the Victorian era. Divorce wasn't a thing, so men sold unwanted wives. Divorce as we know it was not permitted until in the late 19th century, so wife selling was usually a device to end unhappy marriages. It first originated in the 11th century and is said to have been of Anglo-Saxon origin. There are very few records of how it actually happened at that time until the rise of newspaper in the 18th century onwards. Women sold as possessions at marketplaces was a practice that persisted right through the Victorian era in the 1990s. Wife selling was not just a method of self-divorce, but self-marriage, as the act of selling a wife ended the marriage between the wife and seller husband and started a marriage between the wife and buyer husband. In the 17th century it wasn't essential for a marriage to be performed by a clergyman nor recorded in any register. So-called common law marriages were widespread. After that date marriages had to solemnized in church and registered. Divorce was, in practical terms, impossible. The best alternative not only by the husband, but also the wife, who in most cases would willingly sell herself to another suitor. This idea that wife selling was legal also encouraged some men to sell not only their wives but also their children. When a husband and wife decided that their relationship just wasn't working out, they needed to come up with alternative solutions to dissolve their marriage. At the time, women could not vote, they had little to no viable employment options where they could work to support themselves, and there were typically no childcare options. During the 18th and most of the 19th centuries, married British women lived under the conditions of coverture. This made a husband and wife one under the law and gave husbands financial and legal control over their wives. Under coverture, women lost all control of their property once married, unable to buy, sell, own, or inherit anything they possessed before. The pursuit of a career was almost impossible for women because under coverture they had no ability to sign contracts, have legal control over incomes, or other processes that are essential to earning income. Women had no jobs, they only held the positions of wife, mother, peasant, artisan, and nun. Women's lives greatly dependent upon their marriage status and received support from their husbands. A woman's only options outside of marriage were to resort to working in the brothels as prostitutes, or go to the workhouses with their child or children. The wife selling process. Once a husband and wife agreed to the sale, keep in mind that some women were unwillingly sold, and the actual process of selling a wife was very similar to the sale of a commodity or an animal. The sale of a wife was announced in advance, through word of mouth and newspaper advertisements. During the actual process, the woman to be sold would be led to the sale location, usually to the market or public place, and made to stand on an elevated platform in front of a crowd of single men who were looking for a wife. The woman would often be tied in a halter of rope, sometimes with a ribbon, and be held on a leash, which is what they normally do for livestock auctions. Just like a wedding, this took place in crowds of people so that there were a number of witnesses to the transaction. Even if it was honor-based, these witnesses could verify that the sale took place, and the town crier would even announce the sale, just in case. This practice was obviously very demeaning for women, and it made it clear that she was the husband's property, that could be bought or sold. In reality, the wife had to agree to the sale, buyers would bid for the wife. As soon as an agreed upon amount is reached, the wife was sold to the prospective buyer. Thus, drawing a formal end to the marriage. Buyers truly did pay up for women and children. There were sometimes even lawyers on site to sign documentation. The wife also had an opportunity to accept or decline a sale if she found the buyer undesirable. There were also reported cases where it was the wife who approached the buyer and convinced him to complete the transaction, as it would free her from the bond of an unhappy marriage. Wife sales happened more often than not with the consent of the wife. According to research, it was found that only 4 cases between 1760 and 1880 of wife sales occurring without the wife's consent. The price of wife selling. The price of wives varied from meager amounts to legitimize the transaction to rarer high sums. Of course, goods as well as money were exchanged. Among the reports of wife selling published in the 1700s were several that offered some interesting details. For instance, there was a report of one haltered wife being sold in 1750 to a grazier in exchange for an ox. In 1766, a drunken Southwark carpenter sold his wife to a brother Chip, but once sober he regretted the sale, wanted her back, and when she refused, he hung himself in despair. In the 1797 case, a report was made on the sale of a wife at a Fiddleworth auction in Suffolk. The woman was sold to a man she had a previous connection with for 2 shillings and 6 pence. Reports of wife selling continued into the 1800s and were perhaps more common at this time than in the 1700s. In April 1832, when Joseph Thomson sold his haltered wife in Carlisle, the bellman announced her sale at noon to a large and intensely interested crowd after Thomas placed his wife in a large oak chair with a halter around her neck. He then addressed the crowd as follows: "Gentlemen, I offer my wife, Mary Ann Thompson, whom I mean to sell to the highest bidder. It is her wish as well as mine to part forever. She has been to me only a born serpent. I took her for my comfort, but she became my tormentor, a domestic curse, a night invasion, and daily devil. Gentlemen, I speak truth from my heart when I say, may God deliver us from troublesome wives and frolicsome women. I will introduce the bright and sunny side of her. She can read novels, milk cows, laugh and weep with the same ease that you take a glass of ale when thirsty. She can make butter, scold the maid, make rum, gin, or whiskey. I therefore offer her, for the sum of 50 shillings. But Thomson was paid less than he requested, for he got only 20 shillings and a Newfoundland dog which were offered by a man named Henry Mears. Some wives were exchanged for pints of beers. One such example was at Selby in 1862. A wife was sold for a pint of beer which would have cost only 3.5 pence. Towards the end of the 18th century, some hostility towards wife selling began to manifest itself amongst the general population. Reports of wife selling rose from 2 per decade in the 1750s, to a peak of 50 in the 1820s and 1830s. As the number of cases increased, so did opposition to the practice. People began to realize that it inhumane to let a woman go through such a humiliating situation. Protests were implemented and many people fought against this act. It was not until the 1840s that the number of cases of wife selling began to decline significantly, with the practice only occurring among the lower class of Victorians. The last recorded sale took place in 1930. Divorce in the Victorian era only became a thing inaccessible to everyone in the early 20th century, when women started fighting for their rights. Throughout history a lot has happened, some of which is even hard to digest, but it is what it is. What do you think about wife selling? Was it justifiable, or a better alternative would have been used?